Welcome to another episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp, the host of this podcast. I am an author, a very soon-to-be poet, and a lifelong resident of Vermilion County, Illinois. Today's episode is going to be about my thoughts on using ghostwriters, but since it has been more than a month since my last episode of this podcast, I will provide y'all with an update on why there was no episode of this podcast in February. 3 weeks ago, I injured my left leg while trying to carry groceries into my house. I slipped on a patch of ice and fell, with my left leg being the one giving way. I strained pretty much every ligament in my left knee and left ankle, as well as my Achilles tendon, but fortunately I did not require hospitalization since none of my ligaments or tendons tore. I have spent the last 3 weeks rehabbing my left leg at home, and I can say that my left leg has fully healed. Now, let us get to the subject matter of this episode. The practice of ghostwriting, or the practice of someone other than the credited author writing at least part of a written work, has a long history. Ghostwriting is not to be confused with usage of pen names, which are names other than the author's legal name that an author writes under, or the practice of self-published authors hiring editors and/or book cover designers. In many forms of nonfiction, the credited author will lack the proper skill set for an author, especially if the credited author is famous and/or highly skilled in a field outside of written literature. One nonfiction subgenre where usage of ghostwriters is commonplace is political nonfiction. Many political figures, regardless of political party affiliation or political ideology, either do not have the right skill set for writing books or are too busy with other work to write full-length books themselves, so they contract one or more ghostwriters to write at least part of their books for them. Ghostwriting is commonplace and usually non-controversial in many other forms of nonfiction as well, although in fields like academic writing and medical writing, usage of ghostwriters is regarded as extremely unethical and can be considered a form of plagiarism. In fiction, the usage of ghostwriters is surprisingly common. The author of the Nancy Drew series, Carolyn Keene, and the author of the Hardy Boys series, Franklin W. Ditson, are not real-life people. Carolyn Keene and Franklin W. Ditson are the pen names of groups of ghostwriters. In some instances, the estate of a deceased author may hire a ghostwriter to write books under the deceased author's name posthumously. Ghostwriters can be used by publishing houses to increase the number of books written by a highly marketable author. However, as a self-published author, I will not be using ghostwriters to write any portion of any of my books. I am currently writing multiple books in fiction, nonfiction, and poetry categories with the intent of self-publishing books in all three of these categories. Although I am not currently a college or university student, I am working hard on helping myself develop a good author skill set while working on my writing projects. For me, if I were to use a ghostwriter to write my books, I would feel like I am cheating at being an author. There are some, but not all, nonfiction genres where using a ghostwriter would not be considered unethical. But for all of my nonfiction works, I am going to write my works without using a ghostwriter. After all, I am doing everything I can to develop a good writing skill set, and it would be pointless and cowardly to spend a lot of time and effort to build a writing skill set of my own and then turn around and use a ghostwriter. Likewise, for my fiction and poetry works, I will write those without using a ghostwriter as well. There are limited circumstances where I consider use of a ghostwriter for fiction and poetry to not be unethical. All of my fiction and poetry works do not fall under those limited circumstances. I apologize for a very unproductive February, but I hope to be able to get a lot of work done in March. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing and other projects at authoraac.witsite.com/site. You can also follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at Aaron Apollo Camp Writes. I can be reached via email at campaaronapollo@outlook.com. Copyright 2021 by Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for private listening by the podcast audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.